Robert Hayes never expected applause when he stepped into Seattle's most expensive wedding. He only came to walk his daughter down the aisle, but before he could even reach the guest registry, the groom pointed at the tired black man in the faded brown coat and shouted, "Who let this street beggar into my wedding?" Nearly 200 guests stood frozen beneath glittering chandeliers. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. Security closed in while Robert quietly lifted the scratched blue lunchbox he'd carried all morning and simply said, "I'm Claire's father." The groom laughed, ordered him thrown out, and watched as an innocent man gathered his belongings from the marble floor without raising his voice once. As the hotel doors shut behind him, Robert didn't beg. He didn't argue. He only left one calm message: "Tell Claire I came." Hidden inside that battered lunchbox rested an old brass key and a faded photograph that nobody bothered to notice. Within the hour, those forgotten objects would force every person in that ballroom to question everything they thought they knew. And the man who believed he had just thrown away a poor old father was about to discover that some mistakes don't cost a wedding. They cost an entire future. Rain slid slowly down the towering glass walls of Seattle's Meridian Crown Hotel, turning the city lights beyond into blurred ribbons of gold and blue. Evening traffic hummed below as buses hissed through puddles and ferry horns echoed faintly across Elliott Bay. Inside that hotel, warm chandeliers washed the marble lobby in soft amber light, while violin music drifted down from the rooftop ballroom where nearly 200 guests waited for one of the city's most talked-about weddings. Luxury filled every corner. Crystal vases overflowed with white orchids. Servers moved silently between clusters of investors, attorneys, executives, and old family friends dressed in tailored tuxedos and elegant gowns. Champagne glasses caught the light every time someone laughed. Outside, another city existed. A city where rain soaked bus benches and working people hurried home with grocery bags tucked beneath their coats. A city that had just delivered Robert Hayes to the hotel entrance. The city bus pulled away with a hiss, leaving the 61-year-old man standing alone beneath the hotel's covered drive. Robert adjusted the collar of his faded brown coat before looking up at the enormous building. For several quiet seconds, he simply stood there. Not because he felt intimidated, because he was gathering himself. He reached down and lifted the scratched metal lunchbox resting beside his polished but worn shoes. Its faded blue paint had chipped away years ago. On the lid, barely visible beneath decades of scratches, were two hand-carved initials, DM. Robert brushed a thumb gently across the letters before offering himself the smallest smile. "You've lasted longer than most things," he murmured. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his coat as he crossed toward the entrance. A young valet glanced at him, then looked instinctively toward the line of black SUVs parked beside the curb. The contrast was impossible to miss. One guest arrived inside a chauffeured Rolls-Royce. Another stepped from a limousine while photographers snapped discreet pictures. Robert had stepped off Route 594 carrying an old lunchbox. The valet hesitated. "Sir?" Robert stopped. "I'm here for the Hayes Caldwell wedding." The valet blinked. "Oh, yes, sir." His uncertainty lingered for only a moment before training took over. "The elevators are straight ahead." "Thank you." Robert nodded politely and continued inside. Warm air wrapped around him as the revolving doors closed behind his back. The scent of fresh flowers replaced the smell of wet pavement. Conversations floated through the spacious lobby. No one spoke directly to him. Several people looked. One woman quietly lowered her voice while speaking to her husband. Another guest glanced at Robert's coat before pretending to admire a floral arrangement. Robert noticed every glance. Years of experience had taught him to recognize the moment people decided who he must be before learning his name. He never let it change the way he carried himself. He walked with steady shoulders, neither proud nor ashamed, simply present. Near the registration table stood Melissa Grant, 29 years old, professional, organized. She had spent the entire afternoon checking guests into the wedding and directing them toward the rooftop reception. When Robert approached, she smiled automatically. "Good evening, sir. Welcome." "Thank you." He removed his glasses, wiped away a few drops of rain with a folded handkerchief, and smiled back. "I'm Robert Hayes." Melissa began searching the guest list. "Of course, Mr. Hayes." Her finger stopped halfway down the page. "There you are." She looked up again. "You've been expected." Robert's shoulders relaxed just slightly. "I appreciate that. I'll just—" A voice cut across the lobby. "What's going on here?" The room didn't become silent immediately. It became curious first. Heads turned, conversations slowed. Melissa looked up as Ethan Caldwell strode across the marble floor. At 38, Ethan wore a custom tuxedo that fit him perfectly. Everything about him projected confidence. The polished shoes, the expensive watch, the practiced smile. Only tonight, the smile disappeared the moment his eyes landed on Robert. He stopped several feet away and looked Robert over from head to toe. The faded coat, the weathered shoes, the old lunchbox. His expression hardened. Melissa tried to speak. "Mr. Caldwell, this gentleman is—" Ethan lifted one hand. "Who let this man in?" The question rang louder than he intended. Nearby conversations stopped completely. Robert answered before Melissa could. "I'm Robert Hayes." Ethan looked unimpressed. "And?" "I'm Claire's father." The words settled over the lobby. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Ethan laughed. Not loudly, not kindly. The short, dismissive laugh of someone convinced he'd just uncovered an obvious lie. "Claire's father?" He looked toward several guests standing nearby. "Seriously?" A few uncomfortable smiles appeared. No one spoke. Robert remained calm. "Yes. I came to walk my daughter down the aisle." Ethan folded his arms. "My future father-in-law doesn't arrive carrying an old lunchbox." Robert glanced down at the metal box. "It holds something important." "I'm sure it does." Ethan stepped closer. "You need to leave." Melissa found her voice. "Sir, Mr. Hayes is actually listed." "I said he needs to leave." She froze. Robert looked directly at Ethan. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "No." Ethan shook his head. "The misunderstanding is yours." His voice grew louder. "You looked around this hotel and thought nobody would notice a street beggar wandering into a private wedding." The words landed like cold rain. Across the lobby, nearly 200 people had begun paying attention. Some pretended not to. Most simply watched. Robert did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Ethan, toward the elevators leading upstairs. Somewhere above them, Claire was waiting. He had imagined this moment for months. Seeing his daughter, walking beside her, handing her into a new chapter of life. He looked back at Ethan. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone." "Then don't. I'm only asking to see Claire." "That won't happen." "I'd appreciate the chance to explain." "I've heard enough." Ethan snapped his fingers toward two security officers stationed near the entrance. Marcus Reed arrived first. 42 years old, former Marine, now head of hotel security. His younger partner followed half a step behind. Marcus looked from Ethan to Robert, then to Melissa. Something about the situation immediately felt wrong. "Ethan," Marcus said carefully, "is there a problem?" "There is now." Ethan pointed toward Robert. "Remove him." Marcus hesitated. "For what reason?" "He's trespassing." Robert answered quietly. "My name is Robert Hayes." Marcus nodded politely. "Do you have identification, sir?" Robert reached slowly into his coat. Before he could remove his wallet, Ethan stepped forward. "We're not doing this." His hand struck Robert's wrist. The worn leather wallet slipped free. It hit the marble floor. Several items scattered across the polished stone. A faded photograph, an old transit pass, several folded receipts, a weathered union card. The hotel lobby became completely silent. Robert stared down for a brief moment. Then he knelt, one knee against cold marble. He calmly began collecting the pieces. No anger, no complaints. Just careful hands gathering the small fragments of an ordinary life. One guest shifted as though preparing to help. She looked toward Ethan, then slowly looked away. Nobody moved, not one person. Only the soft clink of champagne glasses somewhere across the room broke the silence. Marcus bent slightly. "I can help." "It's all right." Robert offered him a gentle smile. "I've got it." He picked up the photograph first, then the receipts, then the transit pass. His fingers reached for everything except one item. The old union card had slid beneath the edge of the registration table where no one noticed it. Melissa did. She opened her mouth. Before she could speak, Ethan interrupted again. "Enough," he looked at Marcus. "Escort him outside." Marcus inhaled slowly. He hated moments like this. Not because of confrontation, because sometimes rules and conscience stood on opposite sides of the room. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly. Robert rose without resistance. He tucked the wallet back into his pocket, lifted the scratched lunchbox, straightened his coat, then nodded once. "I understand." Marcus walked beside him toward the elevators. Nobody clapped. Nobody protested. Nobody followed. Nearly 200 well-dressed adults simply watched a 61-year-old black father leave his daughter's wedding without speaking a single word in his defense. The elevator doors opened. Robert stepped aside. Before the doors closed, he looked toward Melissa. She was still standing behind the registration table, visibly shaken. "If Claire asks," his voice remained steady, "please tell her I came." Melissa nodded before she realized tears had begun gathering in her eyes. "I will." The elevator doors slid shut. The violin music upstairs continued playing. Guests slowly resumed talking. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone asked for another glass of champagne. Life inside the Meridian Crown Hotel began pretending nothing unusual had happened. Melissa looked down at the registration table. Something caught her eye, half hidden beneath its polished wooden edge, an old union card. She bent down and picked it up. Robert Hayes. She turned it over. Across one corner, someone had scratched 2 tiny letters by hand years ago. DM. Melissa frowned. For reasons she couldn't explain, those initials felt strangely familiar. She looked toward the closed elevator doors, then down at the card still resting in her hand. Something about tonight wasn't over. It had only just begun. 6 hours earlier, long before crystal glasses chimed beneath the chandeliers of the Meridian Crown Hotel, the first sounds Robert Hayes heard that morning were not violins or laughter. They were buses. The familiar groan of diesel engines rolled past Harbor Light Community Kitchen just before 5 o'clock, followed by the squeal of brakes at the corner stop. Rain tapped softly against the narrow windows above the building, where Robert rented a modest apartment no larger than most hotel suites' living rooms. The apartment wasn't much to look at. 2 rooms, old hardwood floors polished by decades of footsteps, a bookshelf filled with repair manuals, biographies, and worn paperbacks whose corners had curled from years of reading, a coffee maker that whistled before it brewed, a small kitchen table positioned beside the window so Robert could watch the city wake up while drinking his first cup of coffee. He never complained about the place. "It keeps the rain off," he often said, "and that's enough." Robert sat quietly at the table as steam curled from his mug. The room carried traces of another life. A blue ceramic bowl that had belonged to Linda, an old quilt folded neatly across the couch, a framed photograph turned slightly toward his chair instead of the room. Linda Hayes smiled from that picture exactly as she always had. Warm, patient. The photograph had been taken 10 years earlier during an autumn street fair. She wore a knitted red scarf and laughed directly into the camera while Robert looked at her instead. He had never liked photographs of himself. She had insisted. "You'll want this someday." She'd been right. Robert reached over and gently straightened the frame. "Big day today," he said softly. "I wish you were here." The apartment answered with silence. Not the lonely kind. The peaceful kind that follows a lifetime shared with someone you still speak to after they're gone. He finished his coffee, washed the mug immediately, and changed into a clean work shirt. The faded brown coat hanging beside the door would come later. First, there was work. Harbor Light Community Kitchen occupied the first floor beneath his apartment. By 6 o'clock, volunteers were already arriving through the back entrance carrying boxes of vegetables donated by neighborhood markets. The kitchen served hundreds of meals each week. Some guests had jobs. Some had recently lost them. Some simply needed one warm place where nobody asked uncomfortable questions. Robert had become part of Harbor Light years earlier. Nobody officially hired him. Nobody officially paid him. Things simply stopped breaking whenever Robert was around. And when they did break, he fixed them. As Robert descended the narrow staircase carrying his worn toolbox, kitchen manager Angela Morris looked up from a clipboard. Angela was 56, practical, quick-witted, and capable of organizing 30 volunteers before most people finished breakfast. She smiled immediately. "I knew those footsteps." "Morning, Angela. You beat the repair company again." Robert looked toward the walk-in freezer. "It's acting up?" She sighed dramatically. "Started making noises around midnight." "Let's go see." Cold air spilled into the hallway as Robert opened the freezer door. He crouched beside the compressor, listened, touched one copper line, closed his eyes. After several quiet seconds, he smiled. "Loose relay." Angela folded her arms. "How do you always know that?" "I listen before I look." He removed a screwdriver from his toolbox. Within 15 minutes, the compressor hummed smoothly again. Angela laughed. "You just saved us another repair bill." Robert shrugged. "You'd have done the same for me." She shook her head. "No. I would have called you." They both laughed. The volunteers inside the kitchen barely noticed another crisis had quietly disappeared before breakfast. That was Robert's way. Problems rarely announced when he'd solved them. By 8 o'clock, breakfast service had ended. People drifted out carrying coffee cups and paper bags. One familiar voice called across the dining room. "Robert?" He turned. Evelyn Carter carefully lowered herself from a chair. 72 years old, silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. A retired librarian whose arthritis had slowly stolen her confidence behind the steering wheel. "You headed toward St. Anne's today?" she asked. Robert nodded. "I've got an appointment." "My ride canceled." Robert smiled before she finished. "I'll take you." "You don't have to." "I know." He picked up his keys. "But we're going the same direction." Outside, rain misted across Tacoma's quiet streets. Robert drove an aging pickup truck whose paint had faded years before. The heater clicked occasionally. The windshield wipers squeaked. Evelyn smiled as they crossed the bridge. "You ever think about buying something newer?" Robert chuckled. "This truck still gets me there." "So do walking shoes." "They're slower." She laughed. "I suppose that's true." At the hospital entrance, Robert helped her from the truck. She squeezed his arm. "I'll pay you back for the gas." "You already have." "When?" "You baked me peach cobbler last month." Evelyn smiled. "I guess we call it even." As Robert drove away, she watched until the truck disappeared into traffic. Some people accumulated wealth. Robert accumulated gratitude. He never kept count of either. Near noon, he stopped beside a construction supply warehouse where Marcus Hill waited outside, wearing a heavy work boot on one foot and a medical brace on the other. Marcus was 58, strong shoulders, kind eyes. A back injury months earlier had cost him steady employment. Now eviction notices arrived more regularly than job offers. "You heading somewhere?" Robert asked. Marcus shrugged. Anywhere hiring? Robert reached into the passenger seat. I packed lunch. Marcus looked embarrassed. I'm all right. You are. Robert handed him the paper bag anyway. But you'll be better after eating. Marcus accepted it quietly. Turkey sandwich, apple, bottle of water, homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper. Linda's recipe? Marcus asked. Robert nodded. I still can't make them as good. Marcus smiled. They're close. He paused. I'll pay you back. Robert laughed softly. You've been saying that for 3 years. And one day I will. I know. Robert started the truck. That's why I keep believing you. Marcus watched him drive away. Not once had Robert made him feel like charity. Only like a neighbor. By early afternoon, Robert finally returned home. The apartment felt unusually still. Today wasn't an ordinary day. He showered carefully, shaved, pressed the wrinkles from his gray suit. It wasn't expensive. The elbows had been repaired years earlier. One button had been replaced by Linda herself. The stitching no longer matched perfectly. Robert refused to change it. He ran his fingers gently across the sleeve. You always said nobody notices. He smiled. You were wrong. He opened the bedroom closet. On the highest shelf rested an old metal lunchbox. Blue paint, scratches everywhere. 2 carved initials. DM. Robert carried it to the table with unusual care. Inside rested only 4 things. A brass key, an old black and white photograph, a folded handwritten note, and an envelope addressed simply, Claire. He removed the photograph first. 2 men stood beside a half-finished workshop. Robert looked almost exactly as he did now, only younger. Beside him stood a thin 20-year-old man wearing oversized work gloves and an awkward smile beneath a borrowed hard hat. Neither looked wealthy, both looked exhausted. Yet both looked hopeful. Robert smiled at the memory. So, you were stubborn, he whispered. The brass key came next. Heavy, worn smooth by years of use. Then the folded note. He read only the final sentence. You gave me a future when I had none. Daniel Robert folded it carefully again. Last came Claire's envelope. He hesitated, then placed everything gently back inside the lunchbox. He closed the lid, ran one thumb across the carved initials, and picked up his coat. Today's visit wasn't about the lunchbox. It wasn't about old memories. It wasn't even about himself. It was about walking his daughter down the aisle. Nothing more. Nothing less. As he reached the apartment door, Angela called from downstairs. You heading out? Robert smiled over the railing. I am. Nervous? A little. You'll do great, he laughed. I only have one job. And what's that? Robert looked toward the rainy street beyond the kitchen windows. Be her father. Neither of them knew that before sunset, someone would decide that wasn't enough. Across Elliott Bay, the Meridian Crown Hotel rose above downtown Seattle like a glass lantern in the rain. By 3 o'clock, the rooftop ballroom had been sealed off from the rest of the building. Staff moved through the space in polished shoes, carrying trays of champagne beneath white orchids suspended from thin silver frames. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, ferries crossed the dark water like slow-moving lights, their horns rolling through the damp afternoon. Everything inside had been arranged to suggest ease. Nothing had been easy. Ethan Caldwell stood near the center aisle with a phone pressed to one ear and a seating chart in his other hand. No, he said sharply. Move the regional partners closer to the front. Table 6 is too far back. The wedding planner, Diana Wells, watched him with the exhausted patience of someone who had been correcting emergencies since sunrise. Table 6 is 12 feet from the ceremony arch. 12 feet matters. To whom? To people who notice. Diana lowered her clipboard. Most guests will be watching the bride. Ethan finally looked at her. Most guests don't control public infrastructure contracts. That ended the conversation. Diana walked away without replying. Ethan turned toward the ballroom. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. White orchids under warm chandelier light, crystal glasses placed at identical angles, a string quartet tuning near the windows, waiters in black jackets moving between tables covered in pale linen. Executives from North Star Urban Systems were already arriving downstairs. So were attorneys from 2 investment firms, city consultants, and several members of Seattle's business community. More important, representatives from Mason Global had confirmed attendance. Daniel Mason himself was expected before the ceremony. That possibility had changed the wedding from a private celebration into something Ethan considered useful. For nearly a year, North Star had been pursuing Mason Global's regional transportation contract. The project would place automated electric shuttles, transit hubs, and digital traffic systems across 3 counties. It was worth more than any deal Ethan had ever supervised. If Daniel Mason approved the partnership, Ethan's position at North Star would become nearly untouchable. Tonight had to look perfect. Not loving, not warm. Perfect. Marcus Reed entered through the service doors. He had changed from his hotel security uniform into a dark suit, but the small radio clipped beneath his jacket remained visible. He carried himself with the habit of a man trained to examine rooms before entering them. "Staff briefing is complete," Marcus said. "East entrance is closed. Public elevator opens only to registered guests." Ethan nodded. "And the street access?" "Covered. There's a community meal program 2 blocks south." "I'm aware. They've had people wandering up this way before." Marcus's expression changed slightly. "People walking through the neighborhood isn't the same as wandering into your wedding." Ethan ignored the correction. "I don't want anyone who looks out of place reaching this floor." Marcus studied him. "What exactly does out of place mean?" Ethan gestured toward the ballroom as though the answer were obvious. "You know what tonight is. A wedding. It's more than that. For you, maybe." Ethan's jaw tightened. Marcus had worked security at the Meridian Crown for 7 years. He had protected diplomats, musicians, athletes, and corporate leaders. He had also learned that wealth made some people believe instructions became reasonable merely because they gave them. "My staff will check names," Marcus said. "We won't remove anyone based on clothing. Use judgment." "We will." Ethan leaned closer. "Daniel Mason is coming. If there is a disturbance, it reflects on North Star." Marcus held his gaze. "If someone is on the guest list, they belong here." A server passed between them carrying a tower of empty champagne flutes. For one moment, the glasses trembled softly against each other. Ethan smiled, but no warmth reached his eyes. "Just keep the evening clean." Marcus walked away without promising anything. Near the windows, Claire Hayes stood with her mother's closest friend, Angela Morris, who had driven up from Tacoma after the morning shift at Harbor Light. Claire wore a silk robe while a stylist made final adjustments to her hair. Her wedding gown waited in the adjoining room, hanging beneath soft lights like something made of ivory mist. At 34, Claire had spent most of her adult life learning how to enter rooms that had not been built with her in mind. She knew when to speak, when to soften an opinion, when to laugh, when to pretend a comment had not landed. That skill had helped her rise from a small nonprofit communications office to a senior position advising major clean energy firms. It had also exhausted her in ways she rarely admitted. Angela looked across the ballroom toward the tables. Your people are back there." Claire followed her gaze. The seats reserved for Robert's friends, Harbor Light volunteers, and several relatives from Tacoma had been placed near the service corridor. From those tables, the ceremony arch was partly blocked by a floral installation. Claire's mouth tightened. "I asked Ethan to keep both families together. Looks like he heard half of that. I'll fix it." "You said that yesterday." Claire turned toward Angela. "I'm handling a lot." Angela's expression softened. I know. Claire looked away. The skyline beyond the windows had vanished behind low clouds. Rain traced thin paths down the glass. I don't want to fight today. Angela crossed her arms. Sometimes avoiding a fight just gives somebody else permission to decide what matters. Claire did not answer. She had heard similar warnings before. From Savannah, her closest friend. From Angela. Once even from Robert. Ethan had called Harbor Light a rough little place after seeing it for the first time. He had joked that Robert's pickup truck looked old enough to vote. He had suggested Claire describe her childhood as working class rather than poor, because it sounded more polished in certain rooms. Each remark had seemed small enough to dismiss. Together they formed something Claire did not want to name on her wedding day. She looked toward the elevators. What time is it? 3:15. My father said he'd be here early. Angela smiled. Robert is early to his own breakfast. Claire reached for her phone. No message. She called. The line rang. No answer. He may be driving, Angela said. He said he was taking the bus. Angela looked surprised. From Tacoma? He doesn't like leaving the truck downtown. That sounds like him. Claire ended the call and tried again. Still nothing. A wedding assistant stepped into the room. Ms. Hayes, the photographer needs 5 minutes near the west windows. Claire nodded, but her eyes remained on the elevator doors. Downstairs, Melissa Grant was arranging cream-colored place cards across the registration table. She had checked the guest list twice. Robert Hayes, bride's father. His name appeared near the top, marked with a small gold symbol indicating immediate family. Beside it, someone had handwritten a note. Will arrive independently. Please direct upstairs. Melissa checked the lobby clock. 3:22. A cluster of guests entered from the rain, laughing as a valet hurried behind them with umbrellas. Melissa greeted each one by name. At the rooftop entrance, Ethan continued rearranging the evening. He moved a retired teacher from table 4 to table 9 because a venture capitalist had arrived unexpectedly. He told a waiter to replace the standard sparkling water on Daniel Mason's table with a French brand that cost 4 times as much. He ordered the hotel florist to remove 2 centerpieces because the greenery looked too local. Then his phone rang. His father. Ethan stepped into the corridor. Everything's on schedule. A pause. Yes, Mason confirmed. Another pause. No, Claire's family won't be a problem. He listened, his face tightening. I know what's at stake. When he returned, Claire was standing near the ceremony arch in her robe. Ethan, he smiled instantly. There she is. Why is my family seated near the kitchen? His smile remained in place. It's not near the kitchen. It's the west section. It's behind a wall of flowers. I'll have one arrangement moved. All of them. Claire, the front tables are reserved for business guests. This is not a business dinner. No, but those relationships are paying for the future we're building. My father belongs in the front row. He has a seat. Beside me. Ethan sighed. Of course he does. Then make sure that's where he sits. He reached for her hand. Don't let table cards ruin your day. Claire pulled her fingers away before he could take them. Has he arrived? Ethan glanced toward the elevators. Not yet. At that exact moment, several floors below, the public elevator opened into the Meridian Crown lobby. Robert stepped out wearing his faded brown coat, the scratched lunchbox hanging at his side. Rain still glistened across his shoulders. He paused beneath the chandeliers and looked toward the registration table. Melissa saw him. Then she saw the name on the list. Robert Hayes. Expected. Family. Before she could call out, Ethan appeared at the top of the curved staircase, having come down to greet a group of North Star executives. His gaze crossed the lobby. It stopped on Robert. And in the space of a single breath, before asking one question, Ethan made up his mind about who that man could not possibly be. He could not be family. Not tonight. Not at this wedding. Not standing beneath crystal chandeliers wearing a faded brown coat with reins still clinging to the shoulders. Ethan descended the curved staircase without hurrying. His polished shoes made almost no sound against the marble, but heads turned anyway. Guests recognized the groom instantly, smiling as he passed. Those smiles disappeared when they saw where he was headed. Robert remained exactly where he stood. The scratched lunchbox rested comfortably in his right hand. His left hand, the one that never quite closed completely after an old injury, stayed tucked inside his coat pocket against the cold. Melissa looked nervously between the two men. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, "this is—" Ethan raised one finger without looking at her. "I'll handle it." Melissa fell silent. Robert offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon." Ethan didn't return it. Instead, he studied Robert the way someone might inspect damage after a storm. The coat, the shoes, the old lunchbox, even the bus transfer sticking halfway from Robert's wallet pocket. Everything confirmed whatever conclusion Ethan had already reached. "This is a private event." Robert smiled gently. "I know. So how did you get in?" "I came through the front entrance." Several nearby guests chuckled quietly. Ethan did not. "I'm asking who invited you." "My daughter." Ethan's expression hardened. "And who is your daughter?" "Claire Hayes." The lobby seemed to shrink. Conversation faded one table at a time until only the distant violin rehearsal from upstairs floated faintly through the building. Melissa swallowed. She looked down at the guest list again. Robert Hayes. Bride's father. Everything matched. She opened her mouth. "Mr. Caldwell, he's actually—" "I don't remember asking for help." His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Melissa looked down immediately. Robert watched the exchange with quiet sadness. He had seen this before, someone trying to do the right thing until authority entered the room. Ethan folded his arms. "So you're telling me you're Claire's father?" "Yes." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything." Robert's voice remained calm. "I only came to walk her down the aisle." Ethan laughed once. It wasn't a joyful sound. It carried just enough volume for people across the lobby to hear. "That's creative." Robert said nothing. "You know what I think?" "No." "I think you saw expensive cars outside." Ethan gestured toward the entrance. "You saw wealthy people dressed for a wedding." He pointed toward the ballroom elevators. "And you figured maybe somebody would feel sorry for you." A few guests looked uncomfortable. No one interrupted. Robert remained still. Rainwater slowly dripped from the hem of his coat onto the polished marble floor. "I don't need anyone's pity." "No?" "No. I think you do." Ethan stepped closer. "If you're looking for charity, there are organizations that help." Robert looked directly into Ethan's eyes. "I'm not asking for charity." "What are you asking for?" "The chance to see my daughter." The simplicity of the answer lingered for a moment. Melissa watched Ethan carefully. She hoped he would ask one question. Just one. Ask Claire. Ask for identification. Ask to see the guest list. Instead, Ethan reached toward the scratched lunchbox. "What is this?" "My gift." "For Claire?" "Yes." Ethan took hold of the handle before Robert could react. The lunchbox lifted slightly between them. Old paint flaked onto the marble. Guests leaned closer. "This?" Ethan held it up. "You wrapped your daughter's wedding gift in an old lunchbox?" "It means something to our family." "It looks like something pulled from a garage sale." Robert gently reached toward it. "If you don't mind." Ethan released it with visible disgust. The lunchbox settled back against Robert's leg. "I mind appearances," Robert answered quietly. "I've noticed." For the first time, Ethan's composure cracked. You know what? He looked around the lobby. I've spent months planning today. His voice grew louder. Months making sure every detail reflects the future Claire and I are building. He looked back at Robert. And then somebody walks in looking like... He paused, searching. Finally, the words came. A street beggar. Silence. No violin, no laughter. Even the hotel staff stopped moving. Robert absorbed the insult without changing expression. Not because it didn't hurt. Because he had learned years ago that some people waited eagerly for visible pain. He would not give Ethan that satisfaction. I've been called worse. The answer surprised several guests. Not because of what he said. Because of how peacefully he said it. Ethan mistook that peace for surrender. Then this won't bother you. He snapped his fingers toward the security desk. Marcus Reed arrived almost immediately. His younger officer followed several steps behind. Marcus looked first at Robert, then Ethan, then Melissa. He sensed trouble before anyone spoke. Ethan? I want him removed. Marcus glanced at Robert. Sir? My name is Robert Hayes. Marcus nodded. Do you have identification? I do. Robert slowly reached inside his coat. He removed an old leather wallet softened by decades of use. Before he could open it, Ethan slapped the wallet sideways. It flew from Robert's hand. Time seemed to slow. The wallet struck the marble. Its contents spilled across the floor. An old transit card, several folded receipts, a worn photograph, the edge of a handwritten envelope, a weathered union card. Everything scattered in different directions. Nobody breathed. Robert stared quietly at the floor. Not because he was embarrassed, because every item represented years no stranger could understand. He lowered himself carefully onto one knee. His damaged left hand moved slower than the right. The old injury never fully healed. He reached first for the photograph, then the receipts, then the envelope addressed to Claire. One piece at a time. Across the lobby, an older guest instinctively stepped forward. She bent slightly, her hand extended toward the transit card. Then Ethan looked at her. She froze, awkwardly withdrew her hand, and walked back beside her husband without saying a word. Others noticed. None moved. The only sounds came from Robert's fingertips brushing gently across polished marble. Marcus shifted uneasily. I'll help you. Robert looked up. His eyes carried no anger, only quiet dignity. Thank you, he smiled softly. But I can manage. Marcus hesitated. He wanted to kneel anyway. Instead, he remained standing. The moment passed. Years later, he would remember that decision more clearly than almost anything else in his career. Robert gathered the photograph, the envelope, the transit pass, the receipts. He placed each item back inside the worn wallet with extraordinary care. The union card remained beneath the registration table, hidden from his view. Melissa saw it slide into the shadows. She nearly called out. Ethan spoke first. Enough. His voice echoed through the silent lobby. I've entertained this long enough. He looked directly at Marcus. Escort him out. Marcus answered carefully. Mr. Hayes is cooperating. I didn't ask whether he's cooperating. I asked you to remove him. Marcus looked once more toward Melissa. She subtly lifted the guest list. Robert Hayes, bride's father. Marcus noticed. So did Ethan. Before Marcus could say anything, Ethan lowered the paper with one hand. I know exactly what he's claiming. Marcus frowned. We should probably verify. I don't need verification. What if he's lying? Robert stood slowly. He tucked the wallet into his pocket, picked up the lunchbox, straightened his coat, then looked at Marcus. It's all right. Marcus hated hearing those words. Sometimes the people suffering made the hardest decisions easier for everyone else. I'm sorry, sir. I know. Marcus gently placed one hand near Robert's elbow. Not pushing, simply guiding. Together they walked toward the elevators. Nearly 200 adults watched. Corporate executives, law partners, investors, professors, neighbors, friends. Not one voice challenged what they had just seen. Someone quietly lifted another champagne glass. Someone pretended to answer a text message. Someone stared determinedly at the floral arrangements. The elevator doors opened. Robert stepped inside. Just before they closed, he turned toward Melissa. She was still clutching the guest list. Her eyes glistened. "If Claire asks," his voice remained warm, "please tell her I came." Melissa nodded before tears escaped. "I promise." The doors slid shut. Marcus watched the elevator descend. Something twisted inside him. He had protected hundreds of important guests over the years. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered whether he had protected the wrong person. The lobby slowly returned to motion. Servers resumed carrying trays. Guests resumed conversations. The violin quartet began another rehearsal upstairs. It was as though the building itself wanted to erase what had happened. Melissa remained behind the registration table. She stared at the marble floor. Something caught the light beneath the table's carved wooden edge. She bent down. There it was, the old union card, Hub Barrett's name stretched across faded lettering. She turned it over. Near one corner, someone had scratched two small initials decades earlier. DM. Her fingers stopped. She had seen those letters somewhere recently. Not on the guest list, not in the hotel, somewhere else. Before she could remember where, applause erupted upstairs. The first wave of distinguished guests had arrived, and among those expected before sunset was a man whose initials were also DM. Upstairs, the rooftop ballroom glowed beneath hundreds of hanging lights that reflected softly against the rain-streaked windows. Seattle stretched beyond the glass in shades of silver and charcoal, the harbor disappearing beneath low clouds. Ferries moved across the water like floating lanterns, while the first evening lights blinked on across the skyline. Inside, every table shimmered. Every flower stood perfectly arranged. Every chair faced the aisle where Claire Hayes was supposed to begin the happiest walk of her life. Instead, she stood alone before a mirror. Her wedding gown had finally replaced the silk robe she'd worn all afternoon. The ivory satin fit perfectly. The veil drifted almost to the floor. Anyone seeing her for the first time would have thought she looked like every bride dreamed of looking. Only her eyes betrayed her. She glanced towards the door for what felt like the 100th time. He should have been here by now. Angela Morris stood nearby, adjusting a loose ribbon on one of the bouquets. "Robert's never late." "I know." Claire checked her phone again. No missed calls, no text messages, no voicemail. She pressed the call button one more time. The familiar ringing echoed through the quiet dressing suite. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She lowered the phone slowly. A strange feeling settled into her chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just a quiet sense that something wasn't right. A bridesmaid peeked through the doorway. "They're seating guests." Claire nodded absently. "Thank you." The woman disappeared again. Angela watched Claire carefully. "You all right?" "I don't know. He probably got caught in traffic." "He took the bus." Angela smiled faintly. "That's true." Claire laughed softly despite herself. "He said parking downtown was a waste of money." "That sounds exactly like Robert." Claire looked back at the mirror. "He promised he'd be early. He also promised he'd walk you down that aisle." "He always keeps his promises." Angela didn't answer. She hoped those words remained true. Outside the dressing suite, wedding coordinator Diana Wells hurried down the hallway carrying 2 clipboards. She nearly collided with Melissa Grant. Melissa looked pale. "Diana, I don't have time." You need to hear something. Diana stopped walking. What happened? Melissa lowered her voice. There was a man downstairs. So? He said he was Claire's father. Diana blinked. What? Mr. Caldwell had security remove him. Diana stared. No. I'm serious. Did anyone verify his name? Melissa lifted the guest list she still carried. I tried. And he wouldn't let me. Diana's expression hardened. Where is he now? I don't know. Before either woman could continue, Ethan appeared from the opposite hallway. His tuxedo looked immaculate. His smile had returned. Only someone watching closely would have noticed the tension behind it. There you are. He looked from Diana to Melissa. Everything all right? Melissa hesitated. Diana answered first. She was asking about seating. Good. Ethan smiled. Because we've got 15 minutes. Melissa looked directly at him. Mr. Caldwell. His smile faded slightly. Yes? The gentleman downstairs. What about him? He really did say he was Claire's father. I heard him. He also knew her full name. So could anyone. He was listed on the guest register. Silence. Ethan's jaw tightened. I handled it. Melissa swallowed. But what if, I said... His voice remained controlled. I handled it. Diana noticed Melissa shrinking beneath the pressure. That's enough. Ethan looked toward Diana. You disagree? I think Claire deserves to know. There is nothing to know. A man claimed to be her father. A man lied. You don't know that. I know exactly what I saw. Diana folded her arms. No. You know what you assumed. For one brief second, Ethan's confidence flickered. Then footsteps echoed from the dressing suite. Claire appeared in the hallway. Every conversation stopped. Even Melissa forgot what she was about to say. Claire looked radiant, but her smile disappeared almost immediately. Has anyone heard from my dad? Nobody answered. Claire looked around the hallway. Melissa? Melissa opened her mouth. Ethan stepped forward first. He hasn't arrived yet. Claire frowned. You're sure? I would have told you. Something in his answer felt rehearsed. Not false, exactly. Simply too polished. Claire studied his face. You've seen the guest list? Of course. So he's definitely not here. No. Melissa could no longer remain silent. Claire. Every eye turned toward her. Melissa's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She knew exactly what speaking might cost her. She also knew exactly what silence already had. He was here. The hallway froze. Claire slowly turned. What? Melissa's voice trembled. He came. Claire stared at her. When? A little while ago. Where is he? Melissa looked at Ethan, then back at Claire. I'm sorry. Claire's breathing changed. What happened? No one spoke. Melissa finally whispered the words. Mr. Caldwell had security escort him out. Everything seemed to stop. The rain, the hallway, even the distant music from the ballroom. Claire looked toward Ethan. Her expression wasn't angry, not yet. It was disbelief. No, Ethan sighed quietly. Claire, no. She stepped closer. My father was here? Yes. You had him removed? It wasn't like that. Melissa lowered her eyes. It had been exactly like that. Claire's voice became smaller. What happened? Ethan gently reached for her arm. Let's talk privately. She stepped away from his hand. Here. Guests passing nearby slowed without pretending otherwise. Diana quietly closed the ballroom doors. The hallway suddenly felt much smaller. Ethan lowered his voice. A man arrived. My father. He claimed to be your father. Claire stared at him. He is my father. He He searched for safer words. Confused. Claire shook her head. No. He arrived carrying. I know what he carries. Ethan frowned. You do? An old lunchbox. His silence answered the question. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. You saw it. Yes. And you still... He looked like someone who wandered in off the street. My father came by bus. I know. You know? I saw the transfer sticking out of his wallet. Claire closed her eyes. For one long second, she couldn't speak. Then she looked at Ethan again. You saw all of that. I did. And you never once thought to ask me? I was protecting you. The words echoed strangely in the hallway. Protecting me? Our wedding. My father is part of my wedding. He embarrassed you. Claire almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the sentence seemed impossible. My father embarrasses no one. He showed up looking like... Ethan hesitated. Claire waited. A maintenance worker. He was one. What? He repaired mechanical systems for years. I mean now. He still fixes things. Ethan spread his hands. Exactly. Claire stared at him. Exactly? He could have worn something better. He wore his best suit. It didn't look like it. It doesn't have to. Several guests quietly slipped farther down the hallway. No one wanted to be seen listening. Everyone listened anyway. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Claire, what? I've spent months putting this together. I know. The board members are here. I know. The city commissioners. I know. Daniel Mason. I know. He looked directly into her eyes. $1 billion partnership is sitting downstairs. She answered without hesitation. And my father was standing downstairs. Silence settled between them. Ethan sighed. Sure, you don't understand. Then explain. Appearances matter. Claire nodded slowly. I think that's finally becoming clear. He moved closer. I wasn't trying to hurt him. You called security. I was protecting our future. My future doesn't begin by throwing away my past. Another silence. Longer this time. Diana quietly looked toward Melissa. Neither woman spoke. Claire reached into the pocket sewn inside her wedding gown. She removed her phone again. Called Robert. Straight to voicemail. She called once more. Nothing. A quiet ache settled deeper inside her chest. Not because he hadn't answered, because she knew exactly why. He won't pick up. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Ethan softened slightly. He'll understand later. Claire looked at him as though seeing someone new. No. He won't. Downstairs, applause suddenly rolled upward through the hotel. It started in the lobby, then spread toward the ballroom. Someone opened the main doors. A voice echoed from below. Mr. Mason has arrived. Every executive in the hallway instinctively turned toward the sound. Ethan's face changed instantly. His posture straightened. His practiced smile returned. The businessman replaced the groom. He looked toward the staircase. I have to greet him. Claire didn't move. Ethan, he paused. If my father was standing here right now, her eyes filled, which one of you would you choose to welcome first? He didn't answer, because for the first time all day, he wasn't certain the honest answer would save him. Ethan turned without another word and hurried toward the grand staircase leading to the lobby. Behind him, the applause continued to swell as more guests gathered near the entrance to welcome Daniel Mason. Claire remained motionless. Her wedding bouquet hung loosely at her side. She no longer noticed the music drifting through the ballroom or the photographers waiting patiently for the ceremony that had quietly begun to unravel. Angela stepped beside her. You need to find your father. Claire nodded slowly. I know. I'm going with you. Before Claire could answer, Diana Wells approached carrying a wireless microphone. The guests are asking how much longer. Claire looked at the ballroom through the open doorway. Nearly 200 people were seated beneath white orchids. Many had already turned in their chairs toward the entrance downstairs. The wedding no longer felt like hers. It felt like a performance waiting for its lead actor. "My father comes first," Claire said quietly. She gathered the front of her dress and hurried toward the elevator. Angela followed. Melissa remained standing in the hallway, still holding the forgotten union card. Her eyes drifted toward the lobby below. Something told her this night was moving toward a moment none of them could stop. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. The evening sky settled into a deep gray that blurred the tops of downtown buildings. Traffic splashed through standing water while buses arrived and departed beneath glowing streetlights. 2 blocks from the Meridian Crown Hotel stood a covered bus shelter with faded advertisements lining its glass walls. Robert Hayes sat alone on the wooden bench. His coat was damp despite the shelter overhead. The scratched lunchbox rested beside him. He watched another bus pull away without making any move to board it. He wasn't ready, not yet. The city rushed around him. People hurried home beneath umbrellas. Taxi drivers leaned on their horns. A bicyclist pedaled through puddles with groceries strapped to the back rack. Nobody recognized the quiet man sitting beneath the flickering shelter light. That anonymity had once brought Robert comfort. Tonight it felt unusually heavy. He opened the lunchbox. Inside, every object rested exactly where he had packed it that morning. The folded envelope addressed to Claire, the brass key, the photograph, the handwritten note. He picked up the photograph first. Rain reflected softly across its worn surface. A much younger Robert stood beside an impossibly thin young man wearing oversized work boots and a borrowed hard hat. The young man smiled awkwardly, as though he still wasn't accustomed to having his picture taken. Robert smiled back at the memory. "You hated cameras." His voice barely rose above the rain. The young man in the photograph had been 20 years old, hungry, homeless, determined not to admit either. Robert remembered that first meeting as clearly as if it had happened the previous week. Not because it changed one life, because it quietly changed two. He carefully returned the photograph to the lunchbox. Next came the folded note. Its paper had yellowed around the edges. The handwriting remained bold. "You gave me a future when I had none." Those 8 words carried more weight than any award Robert had ever received. He folded the note again with practiced care. His left hand trembled slightly as he did. Years earlier, shattered bones had never healed perfectly after an industrial accident. Cold weather always reminded him. He flexed the stiff fingers once, before gently rubbing the scar running across his palm. Some injuries never stopped speaking. They simply learned quieter voices. A city bus approached. Its headlights reflected across the wet pavement. Route 594, the same line Robert had taken downtown. The doors opened. The driver leaned slightly toward him. "You getting on?" Robert looked toward the empty seats inside, then back toward the hotel visible several blocks away. "Not this one." The driver nodded. "No problem." The doors closed again. The bus disappeared into the rain. Robert remained where he was. He reached for the brass key. Unlike everything else inside the lunchbox, the key carried no label, just worn brass polished smooth by years of use. He turned it slowly between his fingers. Many people would have mistaken it for an ordinary workshop key. To Robert, it unlocked an entire chapter of life, one he had never discussed with Claire. Not because it was secret, because it had never seemed necessary. He placed the key beside the photograph, then rested both hands quietly on the lunchbox. His eyes drifted across the street toward the glowing hotel windows. He imagined Claire upstairs, probably wondering where he was, perhaps checking her phone, perhaps smiling nervously before the ceremony. He hoped she hadn't seen what happened downstairs. No daughter deserved that memory on her wedding day. Robert reached into his coat and removed his phone. 3 missed calls. Claire. He stared at her name. His thumb hovered above the screen. He could still answer. He could explain. He could tell her everything. Instead, he pressed the phone dark again. "If you're happy," he whispered, "don't come looking." His words disappeared into the rain. Across the street, a newspaper vending box rattled as the wind picked up. A homeless veteran named Samuel Parker, 65 years old, struggled to keep cardboard boxes from blowing into traffic. Robert noticed immediately. He stood, crossed the street without hesitation. "Need a hand?" Samuel looked up. "I've almost got it." Almost still counts. Together they gathered the scattered boxes before a passing truck could crush them beneath its tires. Samuel laughed softly. "Always fixing somebody else's problem." Robert smiled. "It keeps me busy." "You heading somewhere fancy?" Samuel nodded toward the suit. Robert looked down. "I was." Samuel noticed the disappointment in his voice. "Didn't work out?" Robert paused. "No." Samuel studied him for a moment. "Well," he straightened the last box. "Wherever you were supposed to be, they missed out." Robert chuckled quietly. "Thank you." He returned to the bus shelter. Samuel watched him go. There was something about Robert that people recognized almost immediately. Not success, not wealth, steadiness, the kind that made difficult days seem survivable. Back inside the Meridian Crown Hotel, excitement spread through the lobby. Luxury sedans lined the entrance. Camera flashes reflected off polished marble. Executives whispered among themselves. "Daniel Mason's here. I've never met him. They say he remembers everyone's name. No, they say he hardly talks. Think he'll announce the partnership tonight?" Ethan adjusted his tuxedo cuffs one final time. Everything else had begun slipping beyond his control. This he could still manage. He rehearsed the introduction in his mind. Confident, professional, warm enough to build trust, formal enough to command respect. He would greet Daniel, introduce Claire afterward. The wedding would continue. Everything unpleasant would disappear. That was how successful people handled problems, or so Ethan believed. Upstairs, Claire stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. Her wedding dress caught every eye immediately. Guests smiled politely. She barely noticed them. She searched every corner, the registration table, the entrance, the seating area. Nothing. Melissa hurried toward her. "I think he left." Claire swallowed. "Did he say anything?" Melissa nodded. "He asked me to tell you." She struggled to steady her voice. "That he came." Claire closed her eyes. For one heartbreaking moment, she pictured her father standing exactly where she now stood. Waiting. Hopeful. Patient. Until someone decided he didn't belong. Tears blurred her vision. "I'm going after him." She turned toward the front doors. Just then, another black sedan rolled beneath the covered entrance. Unlike the others, there was no fleet of security vehicles, no photographers, no assistants rushing ahead. The driver stepped out first, opened the rear passenger door. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat emerged quietly into the rain. His movements carried none of Ethan's polished performance, only calm confidence. Several executives recognized him immediately. Their conversations stopped. Even the valet staff straightened instinctively. Daniel Mason had arrived. Across the street, still sitting beneath the bus shelter with the old lunchbox resting beside him, Robert had not yet looked up. He had no idea that the man stepping from the black sedan was scanning the hotel entrance with the same thoughtful eyes he had worn 25 years earlier, or that within minutes, everything was about to change. Daniel Mason stepped beneath the hotel awning as rain whispered against the pavement around him. He paused before entering. For a man whose name appeared on buildings, contracts, and financial headlines across the country, he carried himself with surprising quiet. No assistants crowded his shoulders. No cameras followed behind him. His charcoal overcoat was expensive but plain, and his face held the calm concentration of someone accustomed to entering rooms where everyone already wanted something. The valet hurried forward. "Good evening, Mr. Mason." Daniel nodded. "Evening." The revolving doors carried him into the lobby. Warm air replaced the cold rain. The scent of orchids and polished wood settled around him. Conversations stopped almost at once. Executives straightened, investors turned. Several guests moved toward him with eager smiles, each hoping to be the first person he remembered. Ethan reached him before anyone else. "Mr. Mason." His voice carried across the marble with polished confidence. "What an honor. Ethan Caldwell." Daniel looked at the hand extended toward him, then shook it briefly. "I know." Ethan's smile widened. "Of course. North Star sent over the updated transit proposal yesterday. I hope you had a chance to review the final projections." "I reviewed them." "That's wonderful." Daniel removed his overcoat and handed it to the attendant. Ethan continued without missing a beat. "We've reserved a private table near the ceremony platform. Several city officials are here, along with our board chair. I thought after dinner we might have a quiet conversation about the regional rollout." Daniel glanced around the room. Guests stood beneath chandeliers holding champagne and waiting to be noticed. "Tonight is your wedding." "It is." "Then perhaps you should be thinking about your bride." Ethan laughed, as if Daniel had made a charming joke. "Claire understands business." Daniel's expression did not change. "Does she?" Ethan hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned. "She does." Across the lobby, Claire stood near the front doors with Angela beside her. The rain outside framed her in gray light. Her wedding gown was gathered in both hands, lifted just enough to keep the hem from dragging across the marble. She saw Daniel. She also saw Ethan smiling at him as though nothing had happened. For one moment, outrage overcame sorrow. Her father had been sent into the rain. Ethan was discussing contracts. Claire moved toward them. Ethan noticed her and immediately changed his expression. "There she is." He opened one arm as though inviting her into a photograph. Daniel turned. "Mrs. Hayes." Claire nodded. "Mr. Mason, you look like you're leaving." "I'm looking for my father." Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. Ethan spoke quickly. "There was a misunderstanding downstairs." Claire looked at him. "No, there was a decision." Several guests close enough to hear suddenly became interested in their drinks. Daniel watched both of them. "What happened?" Ethan answered before Claire could. "A man entered claiming to be related to the bride. Security removed him before he could disrupt the event." Claire's face tightened. "He was my father." Daniel's attention shifted fully to Ethan. "You removed the bride's father?" He was dressed in a way that created confusion. Claire stared at him. His clothes created confusion? Ethan lowered his voice. "Not here. You already made it public." Daniel remained silent. He had built his career by listening carefully when other people rushed to protect themselves. Ethan saw concern in his face and mistook it for uncertainty. "Mr. Mason, I assure you the matter was handled professionally." Claire shook her head. "You knocked his wallet onto the floor." Daniel looked at Ethan. Ethan's mouth opened. He became argumentative. "He didn't raise his voice once," Melissa said. The words came from behind the registration table. Everyone turned. Melissa stood with both hands pressed against the edge of the desk. Her face was pale, but her voice held. He identified himself. His name was on the list. He offered identification. He asked to see Claire. Ethan's jaw tightened. "This is not the time." Melissa looked at Claire. "I'm sorry." Claire's expression softened for 1 second. "Where did he go?" "I don't know." Melissa looked toward the front doors. "Security took him down. He may still be nearby." Claire gathered her dress and started toward the entrance. Ethan caught her arm. Claire, wait. She pulled away. Do not touch me. The words were quiet. The entire lobby heard them. Daniel watched Ethan's hand fall back to his side. Something in the room had shifted. Not enough for the guests to speak. Enough for them to understand that the wedding was no longer following its script. Daniel stepped toward the registration table. May I see the guest list? Melissa nodded quickly. She turned the book toward him. Robert Hayes, bride's father, immediate family. The entry had been marked hours earlier. Daniel read it twice. The name stirred something faint in his memory, but not enough to take shape. Ethan approached. Mr. Mason, I think we should move upstairs. The board is waiting. Daniel did not look at him. What did the man look like? Melissa answered. Early 60s, black, brown coat, gray suit. Her eyes dropped toward the floor. He carried an old metal lunchbox. Daniel's head lifted. What color? Melissa thought. Blue, I think. Most of the paint was worn off. Daniel became very still. Did it have initials? Melissa stared at him. Yes. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. What initials? DM. For the first time since entering the hotel, Daniel's calm expression broke. Not dramatically, a small tightening around the eyes, a sudden loss of color beneath his skin. He looked toward Claire. What is your father's full name? Robert Hayes. The answer landed differently now. Daniel repeated it under his breath. Robert Hayes. 25 years vanished. He saw a crowded workshop with rain hammering against a corrugated roof, a pair of battered work gloves, a thermos filled with coffee too strong for anyone else to drink, a deep voice saying, "Start again. Machines don't care how many times you fail." He saw Linda setting an extra plate at a small kitchen table, without asking whether the young man intended to stay. He saw Robert holding out a key. Not to a room, to a future. Daniel looked back at Melissa. Where is the lunchbox? He took it with him. Did he leave anything behind? Melissa remembered the card in her hand. She had been holding it so long the edges had pressed into her palm. Yes. She lifted the weathered union card. This. Daniel took it from her carefully. The front was faded from years of use. Robert Hayes, Mechanical Workers Union, Local 86. Daniel turned it over. There, scratched into one corner in uneven letters, were the initials DM, his initials, not printed, carved by hand with the tip of a dull screwdriver one rainy evening when he was 20 and afraid he would lose the only place that had ever felt safe. A memory returned with painful clarity. Daniel had laughed as he marked the card. If I put my initials on it, you have to remember me. Robert had smiled. Son, I don't need initials for that. Daniel's fingers tightened around the card. Claire watched his face. You know him. It was not a question. Daniel lifted his eyes. Yes. Ethan stepped closer. How? Daniel did not answer him. He looked toward Marcus Reed, who had just emerged from the security corridor. You escorted Robert Hayes out? Marcus stopped. His expression told Daniel everything before he spoke. Yes, sir. Where did you leave him? Outside the west entrance. How long ago? Maybe 20 minutes. Daniel turned toward the glass doors. Rain fell heavily beyond them, silver beneath the hotel lights. Claire moved beside him. I'm coming. Daniel nodded once. Ethan stepped into their path. Mr. Mason, this is getting out of proportion. Daniel looked at him. The expression was not angry. It was colder than anger. A man was removed from his daughter's wedding after proving he belonged here. He didn't prove anything. Daniel raised the union card. He shouldn't have had to. Ethan glanced at the worn piece of plastic and failed to understand why it mattered. He was carrying an old lunchbox and wearing a second-hand coat. Anyone could have Stop. Daniel's voice remained low. Ethan stopped. It was the first command all evening he obeyed without resistance. Daniel turned to Marcus. Which direction did he walk? Marcus pointed through the window. Toward 5th. There's a bus stop 2 blocks down. Daniel headed for the doors. Guests parted in front of him. Claire followed, lifting the hem of her gown. Angela moved beside her. Marcus came behind them, shame visible in every step. Ethan remained beneath the chandeliers. For several seconds, no one looked at him. Then he noticed that Melissa was staring at the card in Daniel's hand. What is so important about that? Melissa answered slowly. I don't know. Outside, Daniel stepped into the rain without waiting for an umbrella. The cold water darkened his shoulders immediately. He looked down the street. Headlights moved through the wet evening. Umbrellas passed. A bus pulled away from the curb. Then, beneath a flickering neon advertisement at the next shelter, Daniel saw a black man sitting alone with a scratched blue lunchbox beside him. 25 years had changed the hair, the coat, the weight carried in the shoulders. It had not changed the way Robert Hayes sat when he was trying to hide pain from everyone around him. Daniel crossed the street. Behind the hotel's glass walls, nearly 200 guests turned to watch. And Ethan Caldwell finally began to wonder why one of the most powerful men in America was running through the rain toward the father he had thrown away. Daniel crossed 5th Avenue without waiting for the traffic light. A horn sounded. Water sprayed from the tires of a passing sedan. He barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the man beneath the bus shelter. Robert sat with both hands resting on the scratched lunchbox, shoulders slightly bowed beneath his wet brown coat. The flickering advertisement above him cast alternating bands of blue and white across his face. For a moment, Daniel was no longer 45 years old. He was 20 again, cold, hungry, certain that the world had already decided what kind of man he would become. Then Robert looked up. The distance between them disappeared. Daniel slowed only when he reached the shelter. Rainwater ran down his face and collar. His breathing came hard, not from the short run, but from everything he had carried across 25 years without realizing it. Robert rose carefully. His damaged left hand gripped the bench for balance. He studied Daniel's face as though confirming that the man before him was real. Daniel. The billionaire's composure broke. He stepped forward and wrapped both arms around Robert. Not a formal greeting, not the careful embrace of business associates posing for photographs. He held him with the force of someone finding home after years away. Dad, Daniel said. His voice cracked on the word. Why didn't you call me? Across the street, the hotel entrance went silent. Claire stopped beneath the awning. Her wedding dress darkened where the rain touched its hem, but she did not seem to feel the cold. Angela stood beside her, one hand pressed to her mouth. Marcus Reed remained several steps behind them. Ethan appeared in the doorway just as Daniel spoke again. Why were you sitting out here alone? Robert gently pulled back. I was waiting for the bus. You should have called. You were attending a wedding. Daniel looked across the street toward the hotel. I was attending your daughter's wedding. Robert's gaze shifted toward Claire. Their eyes met through the rain. Pain crossed her face. Robert looked away first. Daniel noticed. What happened? Robert gave a small shake of his head. Not here. Daniel glanced at the wet coat, the old lunchbox, and the faint redness around Robert's wrist, where Ethan had struck the wallet from his hand. His jaw tightened. They told me you were removed. It's done. No. Daniel's voice remained controlled. It happened. That means it isn't done. Robert sighed. You always did argue like a lawyer. You taught me not to walk away from the truth. Robert almost smiled. I taught you to pick your battles, and you taught me some battles pick you. The words hung between them. Claire finally stepped into the rain, Her shoes slipped slightly on the wet curb, and Angela caught her elbow. Robert moved instinctively toward her. Careful. Even now, after everything, his first reaction was concern. Claire reached the shelter and stopped several feet away. "Daddy." Robert lowered his eyes. She had not called him that in years, not since her career had carried her into polished offices, where people spoke about neighborhoods like his as statistics instead of homes. "I'm sorry," she said. The rain filled the silence between them. "I didn't know." Robert looked at her then. "No." His voice was gentle. "You didn't." That answer hurt more than anger. Claire's lips trembled. "I should have." Robert did not rescue her from the truth. He simply nodded once. "Yes." Daniel watched them carefully. He understood now that the insult at the hotel was only the newest wound. Something older lived between father and daughter. Something made of distance, embarrassment, and all the conversations they had postponed. Claire looked at Daniel. "You called him Dad." "I did." "How do you know my father?" Daniel glanced at Robert. Robert gave no sign that he objected. So Daniel stepped beneath the shelter and looked down at the lunchbox. "May I?" Robert lifted it onto the bench between them. The metal latch resisted before opening with a soft click. Inside lay the photograph, brass key, handwritten note, and sealed envelope addressed to Claire. Daniel reached for the photograph. His fingers paused above it. "I haven't seen this in years." Claire leaned closer. The younger man beside Robert was painfully thin, his work shirt hanging loosely from his shoulders. The hard hat sat too low over his forehead. His smile was hesitant. "That's you?" Daniel nodded. "I was 20. Ethan had now crossed the street with several North Star executives following at a distance. He stopped outside the shelter, unwilling to step fully into the rain. Daniel continued without acknowledging him. "I had no home, no family willing to take my calls. I was sleeping in an abandoned delivery van behind an industrial warehouse in South Seattle." Claire looked at her father. "You never told me." Robert's eyes remained on the photograph. "You were building your own life." Daniel gave him a sorrowful look. That's what he always says when he thinks his sacrifices don't count. Robert closed the lunchbox halfway. Daniel stopped him. "They count." His voice grew firmer. "They count tonight." The wedding guests watched from behind the hotel glass. Some had begun recording. Others lowered their phones, suddenly uncomfortable, turning the moment into entertainment. Daniel looked at Claire. "Your father supervised mechanical systems at the warehouse where I worked nights. The company hired temporary labor through cash contractors. People like me were useful because we were desperate and easy to replace." Robert's damaged hand tightened around the lunchbox handle. "There was a fire," Daniel said. "The company had ignored electrical warnings for months. A loading mechanism locked during the evacuation. I was trapped behind a collapsed steel frame." Claire's face changed. She looked at Robert's left hand, the fingers that never fully closed. "The injury," she whispered. Robert said nothing. Daniel answered for him. He went back inside. Ethan shifted uneasily. The North Star executives exchanged glances. Daniel's voice stayed calm, but each word carried weight. Everyone else had been ordered away from the structure. Robert heard me calling and went through a service passage filled with smoke. He cut through a jammed support bracket with a manual saw, pulled me out, and stayed beside me until the paramedics arrived. Robert looked down. "Anybody would have tried." "No," Daniel said. "Several people didn't." The sentence carried across the street more sharply than any accusation. Marcus Reed lowered his head. Daniel turned the photograph over. On the back, Linda Hayes had written a date and 4 words: "First day of the future." She and Robert gave me their spare room. Daniel continued. Linda made me eat at their table even when I insisted I wasn't hungry. Robert got me into an apprenticeship program after every supervisor I met decided I looked unreliable. Robert gave a quiet laugh. You were unreliable. I was scared. That too. For the first time, warmth touched the shelter. Brief, fragile, real. Daniel lifted the brass key. This opened a garage near the freight yards. One leaking roof, one broken heater, enough room for 2 workbenches. Claire looked at him. Your first company? My first chance. He handed the key to her. Your father signed the lease because no landlord would rent to me. He spent his savings on equipment and taught me mechanical design at night after working full shifts. Ethan finally spoke. Mr. Mason, I'm sure Mr. Hayes was very helpful, but perhaps we should discuss this inside. Daniel turned slowly. Rain had soaked Ethan's tuxedo shoulders. For the first time that evening, the groom looked uncertain in his own expensive clothing. Helpful? Daniel repeated. Ethan immediately corrected himself. I meant instrumental. Robert was not instrumental. Daniel's voice dropped. He was family. Ethan glanced toward Robert, then toward the glass hotel filled with witnesses. I had no idea. Robert looked at him. That has been your defense from the beginning. Ethan opened his mouth. Robert raised one hand, not threatening, simply asking for silence. You didn't know I was Claire's father. He paused. You didn't know Daniel called me Dad. Another pause. You didn't know whether I had money, history, or anyone powerful who cared about me. Ethan's face tightened. Robert's eyes remained steady. But you knew I was a man asking to see his daughter. The rain seemed to soften around them. No one answered. Daniel looked at the wedding guests behind the glass, then at Marcus, then at Melissa, who had stepped outside holding Robert's union card beneath her coat. The whole evening had turned on the same question. What did people do when they thought a man had nothing to offer them? Daniel placed the brass key back inside the lunchbox. You're coming inside. Robert shook his head. This is Claire's day. Claire's voice broke. It stopped being my day when I let someone else decide whether you belonged in it. Robert studied her. She did not look away. Daniel closed the lunchbox and handed it back to him. You don't have to forgive anyone tonight. He glanced at Ethan. But they do have to face you. Robert looked toward the hotel. Through the glass stood the same guests who had watched him kneel alone. Now they watched a billionaire wait for his decision. The power in the room had already reversed. But Robert did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply straightened his damp coat and lifted the lunchbox. All right. Claire moved to his right. Daniel took his left. Together they crossed the rain-slicked street toward the Meridian Crown Hotel. Ethan stepped backward as they approached. The revolving doors turned. Warm chandelier lights spilled across Robert's worn shoes, and the man the wedding had thrown away walked back inside between the bride and the billionaire who called him Dad. The revolving doors released them into a silence so complete that the rain outside sounded loud. Water slipped from Robert's coat onto the marble. Claire's ivory dress carried a dark line of rain along the hem. Daniel stood on Robert's left, still holding the weathered union card Melissa had found beneath the registration table. Nobody laughed now. Nobody looked away. The same guests who had watched Robert kneel alone were suddenly studying his face as if dignity had appeared there only after Daniel Mason recognized it. Robert noticed the change immediately. It was in the straightened backs, the lowered champagne glasses, the careful expressions of people already preparing explanations for why they had remained silent. He did not enjoy their discomfort. That was what separated him from Ethan. Robert had no need to make anyone feel small. Ethan stood near the base of the staircase, his tuxedo damp at the shoulders and his confidence visibly fraying. Behind him, several North Star executives had gathered beside the ballroom doors. Board members, consultants, and investors watched Daniel's every movement, trying to determine whether the evening could still be saved. Ethan stepped forward. "Mr. Mason." Daniel did not answer. Ethan tried again. "Daniel." That familiarity earned him a colder look. Ethan quickly corrected himself. "Mr. Mason, I want to apologize for the confusion." Daniel turned slightly toward Robert. "Was there confusion?" Robert looked at Ethan. "No." The single word moved through the lobby like a dropped stone. Ethan swallowed. "I was given incomplete information." Melissa stood behind the registration table, still clutching the guest list. She looked at Claire. Claire gave the smallest nod. Melissa spoke. His name was on the list. Ethan's jaw tightened. Marcus Reed stepped forward from the security desk. He also offered identification. Every face turned toward Marcus. He looked at Robert before continuing. "I should have stopped the removal." Robert held his gaze. Marcus did not look away this time. Ethan spread his hands. "Everyone is acting as though I knew who he was." Daniel's expression hardened. "That is the problem." Ethan shook his head. "No, the problem is that someone arrived dressed in a way that made the situation unclear." Robert glanced down at his coat. The fabric was faded. One sleeve had been repaired near the cuff. Rain had darkened the shoulders. He looked back at Ethan. What should a father wear to be believed? Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came. Robert lifted the scratched lunchbox slightly. And what should he carry? No answer. A photograph? He tapped the metal lid. A letter? He paused. Proof that powerful people know his name? The guests remained silent. Robert's voice stayed gentle. "I told you who I was." Ethan's face flushed. "You have to understand the pressure I was under." Claire stared at him. "The pressure to do what?" "To protect the event." "From my father?" "To protect the future we were building." Robert looked toward the ballroom. White orchids floated above tables worth more than Harbor Light's monthly food budget. Crystal glasses reflected warm light. A string quartet waited with instruments resting silently in their laps. He turned back to Ethan. A future that cannot survive one poor-looking man in the lobby was never much of a future. A murmur moved through the guests. Not disagreement. Recognition. Ethan heard it and grew more desperate. He stepped closer to Robert. "Mr. Hayes, I sincerely regret how this appeared." Robert's eyes sharpened. "How it appeared? I mean, what happened?" "No." Robert shook his head. "You regret who saw it." Ethan's lips parted. Robert continued before he could respond. "You were comfortable when the room believed I had no power." He looked at the guests around them. So were they. Several people lowered their eyes. A man near the bar set his champagne glass down and moved his hand away from it as though the glass itself had become evidence. Daniel stepped forward. "The apology you are offering is not for Robert." His voice was quiet, but the executives near the ballroom doors leaned closer. "It is for your contract." Ethan glanced toward the North Star board chair, William Archer, 63, who stood stiffly beside the elevators. William gave him no support. Ethan looked back at Daniel. "That is not fair." Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "Fair?" He held up Robert's union card. "This belonged to a man who lost his engineering career after reporting dangerous conditions that threatened workers with no influence." Robert lowered his eyes. Daniel continued. "He was pushed out because the company believed he had no one powerful enough to protect him." The card trembled slightly in Daniel's hand. "He still went back into that warehouse when I was trapped." The guests watched Robert differently now. Not because he was connected to money, because his history had become visible. Daniel noticed their attention and turned toward them. Do not make the mistake of admiring him only after hearing what he did for me. The room grew even quieter. He was worthy of respect when he stepped off the bus. Daniel looked toward the place where Robert's belongings had scattered. He was worthy of help when he knelt on this floor. Marcus Reed closed his eyes briefly. The older woman who had almost helped Robert stood near the floral display. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried. Robert turned toward her. She pressed one hand to her chest. "I started to help you. I remember." I stopped. Robert nodded. "I remember that too." The woman's face crumpled. Robert did not humiliate her. He simply said, "Next time, don't." She nodded through tears. "Yes, sir." One sentence, no revenge, no speech. Yet the shame in the room deepened because Robert had offered the crowd a standard instead of an excuse. Claire moved closer to her father. For years she had believed success meant learning how to belong in rooms like this. Now she understood that belonging meant very little if it required pretending not to see the people standing outside them. Ethan noticed her taking Robert's arm. Panic entered his face. "Claire, please." She did not respond. He looked toward Daniel instead. "North Star has spent 18 months preparing for Mason Global's transportation partnership." Daniel nodded. "I know. Our engineering teams have completed every technical review." "I know. We've secured city support. I reviewed the commitments." Ethan took a breath. Then surely one personal misunderstanding should not affect a billion-dollar public project. Daniel studied him. "That project would place your company in charge of transit systems used every day by working people." He pointed through the glass toward the wet street and the bus stop beyond. "People who arrive by bus." Ethan's face tightened. "Business decisions should be based on performance. They should also be based on trust. We have met every requirement." "Have you?" Daniel removed a slim black folder from inside his coat. Ethan stared at it. So did William Archer. Daniel had brought the contract file to the wedding because Ethan had planned to turn a private ceremony into a business announcement. Now that same file rested in Daniel's hand like a judgment waiting to be opened. Daniel spoke slowly. Mason Global was prepared to name North Star Urban Systems the preferred partner for the Cascadia Regional Transit Initiative. Gasps moved through the executives. Ethan looked stunned. He had expected progress. He had not known the decision was that close. Daniel continued. "The preliminary recommendation was completed this morning." Hope flashed across Ethan's face. Daniel saw it, then closed the folder. "That recommendation is suspended." The hope vanished. William Archer stepped forward. "Mr. Mason, perhaps we can discuss this privately." Daniel turned toward him. "Why?" William stopped. Daniel looked around the lobby. "The decision that caused this began publicly." He gestured toward Robert. "The humiliation occurred publicly." Then he looked at the silent guests. "The failure to intervene occurred publicly." His voice remained calm. "So the reason for reconsideration can be understood publicly." Ethan's breathing became shallow. "You cannot cancel a major infrastructure agreement because I asked security to remove one man." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "One man?" The phrase landed badly. Ethan heard it too late. Robert looked at him with something sadder than anger. Daniel stepped closer. "This evening revealed how you make decisions when you believe the person in front of you has no influence." He tapped the closed folder. "The communities affected by this contract will include low-income neighborhoods, elderly riders, injured workers, and adults who rely on public transportation because they cannot afford private cars." Robert thought of Evelyn, Marcus Hill, Samuel beneath the rain, people Ethan would likely describe as out of place. Daniel continued, "If you cannot recognize the dignity of one man at your wedding, why should anyone trust you with systems serving thousands of people you may never consider important?" Ethan looked toward the board chair again. William Archer's face had gone pale. The other North Star executives were whispering now, not about the ceremony, about exposure, risk, the contract, the company. Ethan turned back to Robert. "Sir, please." Robert did not answer. "I apologize." Silent. "I was wrong." Robert studied him carefully. "Would you be saying that if Daniel had not crossed the street?" Ethan's face froze. The question stripped away every prepared word. He could not say yes, not convincingly. Robert nodded once. "That is why your apology means nothing." No one moved. The chandeliers glowed above them. Rain slid down the glass walls. The ballroom waited behind open doors, ready for a wedding that no longer felt possible. Then Claire stepped away from Robert and turned to face Ethan. Her engagement ring flashed beneath the warm lights. For the first time that evening, she looked at it not as a promise, but as a question. Claire lifted her left hand beneath the chandelier light. The diamond caught every warm reflection in the lobby, scattering small flashes across the polished marble. For months, people had admired that ring before they admired anything else about her. 3 carats, platinum setting, custom design. Ethan had chosen it carefully, because as he once told her, a ring should announce the kind of life 2 people were about to enter. Now Clara wondered what kind of life it had really announced. A life where her family was seated near the service doors. A life where her childhood had to be softened into polite language. A life where the man she planned to marry could look at her father and see only an inconvenience. Her fingers closed slowly around the ring. Ethan watched the movement. "Claire." She raised her eyes. There was fear in his face now. Not sorrow, not remorse. Fear. The contract had been suspended. Daniel Mason stood beside Robert. North Star's board members were whispering behind him, and nearly 200 guests had stopped seeing Ethan as the man in control. He stepped closer. "Let's go somewhere private." Claire almost smiled. "You didn't want privacy when you threw my father out." "That was different." "How?" "This is our relationship." "That was my relationship too." Ethan glanced toward Robert. He came at the worst possible time. Robert did not react. Claire did. "My father came to my wedding." "I know." "No, you don't." Her voice remained quiet, but every word carried through the lobby. "You think he came carrying a cheap lunchbox because he didn't understand this place?" She looked toward the scratched metal box in Robert's hand. He understood exactly where he was. Ethan spread his hands. "Shh, Claire. I made a mistake." "You made a decision." "A bad decision. A revealing one." His face tightened. "You're emotional." The words changed something in her. Not loudly, not visibly, but the last trace of hesitation disappeared. For years, Ethan had used that word whenever she challenged him. Emotional, sensitive, overreacting. He never said controlling, never said dismissive, never said cruel. Claire looked around the lobby, at the white orchids, the crystal glasses, the silent guests, at Angela standing near the doors with tears in her eyes, at Melissa behind the registration table, still pale from the courage it had taken to speak, at Marcus Reed, a trained security director who had known better and still obeyed. Then she looked back at Ethan. "I have been trying not to be emotional for 3 years," he frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I laughed when you joked about my neighborhood." "That was harmless." "It means I changed the way I talked around your parents because your mother said I sounded too casual." "My mother can be difficult." "It means I stopped inviting my father to company dinners because you said his clothes made people uncomfortable." Ethan's mouth tightened. I never said that. You said he would feel out of place. That's not the same thing. It is, when you always decide who belongs. A murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan heard it. His face flushed. Claire continued. You told me Harbor Light was depressing. I said it was struggling. You called the people there hopeless. I said the organization needed better management. My father has kept that kitchen running for years without asking anyone for $1. Ethan looked toward Robert. You never told me that. Claire's voice sharpened. I should not have needed to. The sentence landed hard. Robert watched his daughter with quiet sorrow. He could see the truth emerging not only about Ethan, but about the compromises Claire had made to remain beside him. That realization hurt her. It also freed her. She turned slightly toward the guests. Some of you saw what happened. No one moved. You watched my father identify himself. A woman near the flowers lowered her eyes. You watched his belongings hit the floor. Marcus Reed's shoulders tightened. You watched him pick everything up alone. The silence deepened. Claire looked back at Ethan. And you expected me to walk down that aisle afterward as if none of it mattered, he answered quickly. I expected us to handle it after the ceremony. After the photographs? That's not fair. After Daniel signed the contract? That has nothing to do with this. Daniel spoke for the first time in several minutes. It has everything to do with this. Ethan turned toward him. Daniel remained beside Robert, calm and unreadable. You asked your bride to delay her conscience until after you secured what you wanted. Ethan's jaw flexed. You don't know our relationship. No, Daniel said, but I know transactions. The word settled over the room. Claire stared at Ethan. She remembered dinners where he introduced her by title before name, galas where he praised her intelligence but corrected her stories afterward. The night he told her she had married up before they were even engaged, then laughed when she failed to laugh with him. She had called those moments insecurity, pressure, culture, anything but what they were. Ethan reached for her hand. She stepped back. Claire, listen to me. I have been listening. I love you. Her face changed. Not anger, grief. I think you loved the version of me that made you look generous. That's ridiculous. You liked being the successful man with the polished black fiancé. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan glanced toward them. That glance confirmed everything. Even now he was measuring the room. Claire saw it. So many times, she said softly. I asked myself why you never defended my family. He shook his head. I have defended you. That is not the same thing. I brought you into my world. Claire's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. I was never asking to be brought into your world. She looked at Robert. I was asking you to respect mine. Ethan followed her gaze. For the first time, he looked at Robert without contempt. But respect still did not appear. Only calculation. Mr. Hayes, Ethan said, I understand you're upset. I'm prepared to make this right. Robert's expression remained calm. How? A formal apology. To whom? To you. Robert glanced around the lobby. What about Melissa? Ethan looked confused. She tried to tell you who I was. Melissa froze behind the desk. What about Marcus? Marcus lowered his head. You put him in a position where doing his job meant betraying his judgment. Robert looked toward the guests. What about everyone who learned tonight that silence is safer than decency? Ethan's voice tightened. I cannot apologize to an entire building. No, Robert said. You can only decide what kind of man walks out of it. Claire closed her eyes for one breath. When she opened them, she reached for the ring. It resisted slightly at the knuckle. She twisted it once, then again. Ethan's face drank. Claire, don't! The ring slid free. The hand beneath it looked strangely bare. A pale line marked the place where the band had rested. Claire held it between two fingers. The diamond flashed one final time. I spent years making my past smaller so you would feel larger. Her voice trembled, but did not break. I will not spend the rest of my life doing that. She walked to the registration table, placed the ring gently beside the guest list. The soft click of metal against wood carried through the silent lobby. The wedding is over. Ethan stared at the ring, then at Claire. No, she stepped away. No? You don't get to destroy everything because of one mistake. Claire looked at him. You destroyed it when you decided my father was disposable. His breathing quickened. This is insane. No, she shook her head. This is the first honest decision I've made all day. Ethan turned toward Robert. You did this. Robert did not move. I came to walk my daughter down the aisle. You humiliated me. Robert's eyes grew sad. I never asked you to kneel on the floor. The words silenced Ethan instantly. Daniel looked toward the open ballroom. Rows of white chairs waited beneath glowing lights. The quartet sat motionless. Dinner remained covered beneath silver lids. Everything expensive had survived. Only the illusion had broken. Ethan looked toward his parents near the ballroom entrance. His mother, Margaret Caldwell, 64, stood rigid in a pale silver gown. His father, Thomas Caldwell, 68, whispered urgently to William Archer from North Star's board. Margaret hurried forward. Claire, think carefully. Claire turned. I am. You are throwing away stability. I'm walking away from contempt. Margaret lowered her voice. People will talk. Claire looked around the lobby. They should. Thomas approached next. Let's pause the ceremony. Everyone goes upstairs. We resolve this as adults. Robert looked at him. Adults were already in this room. Thomas stopped. The rebuke was quiet. That made it impossible to dismiss. Claire moved beside her father. She took his arm carefully, mindful of the damaged hand. I'm sorry I let it get this far. Robert studied her face. This part is yours to carry. She nodded through tears. I know. But you don't have to carry it alone. Claire leaned against him. For the first time that evening, Robert held his daughter. Not in front of an altar, not for photographs. In the lobby where she had finally chosen truth over appearance. Daniel gave them space. Ethan stood alone beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by guests, executives, and family members who had praised him only an hour earlier. Now nobody approached. Nobody knew whether comforting him might threaten their own position. The same silence that had protected his cruelty turned against him. William Archer stepped toward Daniel. Mr. Mason, regarding the contract, Daniel raised the black folder. We will discuss North Star tomorrow. Ethan looked up sharply. Daniel's eyes settled on him. But before then, my team will review something your company submitted last month. William Archer's face changed. What exactly? Daniel opened the folder and removed a marked report. The community impact projections for South Tacoma, Rainier Valley, and 3 other working-class districts. Ethan's fear returned. Claire noticed. So did Robert. Daniel held up the pages. These numbers do not match the public records. The lobby went still again. The wedding had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. No one moved. The ballroom remained untouched behind the open doors, its rows of white chairs perfectly aligned beneath glowing chandeliers. The quartet still sat with violins resting quietly in their laps, uncertain whether to pack their instruments or continue waiting for instructions that would never come. Outside, rain continued to wash across the hotel's glass walls. Inside, another kind of storm had begun. Daniel Mason closed the black contract folder with deliberate care. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every person in the lobby understood that the evening had shifted far beyond a cancelled wedding. William Archer, chairman of North Star Urban Systems, stepped forward with both hands folded in front of him. He was 63 years old and had spent 4 decades navigating corporate crises. Normally, he spoke before situations became dangerous. Tonight, he had no words ready. "Mr. Mason," he began carefully, "perhaps this discussion should continue in our offices." Daniel looked at him. "Why?" William hesitated. "This is sensitive." Daniel glanced around the lobby. So was what happened to Robert. William lowered his eyes. He understood the answer. The humiliation had happened in public. No private conference room could erase it. Daniel opened the folder again. "I reviewed North Star's community impact assessment 3 weeks ago." He removed several documents. They projected minimal displacement in South Tacoma. He turned another page. They estimated fewer than 30 households would require relocation. William nodded cautiously. "Those are the current projections." Daniel slid another report beside the first. "My analysts found 118. Silence. Daniel continued. "The public presentation removed several neighborhoods entirely." He looked toward Ethan. "Who approved those revisions?" Ethan swallowed. "Our planning department." Daniel asked again. "Who approved them?" Ethan looked toward William. William did not answer for him. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I signed the final submission." Daniel nodded once. "I thought so." A quiet murmur spread among the North Star executives. Several exchanged uneasy glances. This was the first time many of them had heard the numbers questioned so directly. Daniel closed the folder. "The transportation project serves working families." He gestured toward the rain beyond the windows. "People who ride buses because they cannot afford private cars." His eyes settled on Robert. "The same people whose dignity you failed to recognize tonight." Ethan rubbed both hands together. "You're making assumptions about my character." "No." Daniel's voice remained calm. "I'm recognizing a pattern." Robert remained silent. He did not enjoy watching another man unravel. He had seen enough pride collapse over the years to know it never sounded dramatic. It usually sounded defensive. Exactly as Ethan did now. William Archer cleared his throat. "Ethan." Ethan looked toward him. William chose his next words carefully. "Is there anything else Daniel should know before tomorrow's review?" Ethan stared. "What does that mean?" "It means answer honestly." "There isn't anything." Another executive stepped forward. Her name was Rebecca Collins, 51, North Star's chief legal officer. She had remained silent all evening. Now she spoke. "There are pending internal complaints." Ethan turned sharply. "Rebecca!" She ignored him. Daniel waited. Rebecca continued. 3 employee grievances remain under review." William looked surprised. "I wasn't informed." "They were classified as departmental matters." Daniel asked quietly, "What kind of grievances?" Rebecca hesitated, then answered, "Retaliation." The word landed heavily. "And?" She drew a slow breath. "Concerns involving promotion practices." Ethan interrupted. "Those claims are exaggerated." Rebecca met his eyes. "They were never investigated fully." Daniel looked toward William. "Did your board know?" William slowly shook his head. "No." For the first time that evening, genuine disappointment appeared on his face. He turned toward Ethan. "You told us everything had been resolved." "I believed it had." Rebecca spoke again. "The files were never closed." Another silence settled across the lobby. Marcus Reed watched from several feet away. His thoughts had drifted far from contracts and executives. He kept seeing one image: Robert kneeling alone on the marble floor. He stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes." Robert turned. Marcus stood straighter than before. I owe you an apology. Robert listened quietly. I knew something felt wrong. Marcus looked down briefly. I asked if we should verify your identity. You did. I should have insisted. Robert answered honestly. Yes. Marcus nodded. I've spent 20 years telling younger officers that doing the right thing sometimes costs you. He looked around the lobby. Tonight, I forgot my own advice. Robert stepped closer. What happens next belongs to you. Marcus frowned slightly. I don't understand. You cannot change what happened. Robert's voice remained gentle. But you can decide who you become after it. Marcus felt the words settle deeply. No anger, no accusation, only responsibility. He extended his hand. Robert shook it. Several guests witnessed the exchange. One by one, others began approaching. Not dramatically, quietly. The older woman who had nearly helped Robert earlier stepped forward first. My name is Susan. Robert smiled. I know. She laughed softly through tears. No, you don't. I know enough. Susan took a deep breath. I was afraid. Robert nodded. I could see that. I've been thinking about it ever since. She looked toward the marble floor. I kept telling myself someone else would help. Robert followed her gaze. So did everyone else. Susan wiped her eyes. I'm ashamed, Robert answered gently. Then don't waste the feeling. She looked up. Use it. She nodded slowly. I will. After Susan stepped away, another guest approached, then another. None of their apologies changed what had happened. Robert accepted each one with the same quiet grace. He did not erase their responsibility. Neither did he humiliate them. Claire watched her father with growing admiration. As a child, she had believed strength meant winning arguments. Now she understood that real strength sometimes looked like refusing to become bitter. Angela leaned toward her. He hasn't changed. Claire smiled sadly. No. I did. Angela squeezed her shoulder. You found your way back. Across the lobby, Ethan stood increasingly alone. Several executives quietly moved farther away from him. Not out of cruelty, out of caution. Rebecca Collins closed her briefcase. William, he turned. I'm recommending an independent review. William nodded immediately. So am I. Ethan stared. You can't be serious. Rebecca met his eyes. I am. You've worked beside me for years. I've worked beside the company. William looked toward Daniel. North Star will cooperate fully. Daniel answered simply. I expect nothing less. Ethan's breathing grew faster. This is because of one misunderstanding. No, William said quietly. This is because we no longer know whether tonight was a misunderstanding. He looked toward Rebecca. Or a warning. The words struck Ethan harder than anything Daniel had said, because they came from someone who had defended him for years. Daniel placed the contract folder beneath his arm. Mason Global will suspend negotiations pending the review. William nodded. We understand. Ethan did not. This project is worth over $1 billion. Daniel looked at him. I know. You can't risk thousands of jobs. I'm trying to protect them. Ethan frowned. Daniel continued. A company trusted with public transportation must understand the people it serves. He glanced toward Robert. If leadership cannot recognize dignity without first recognizing status, he closed the folder. Then leadership must change before contracts begin. No one argued. The logic stood on its own. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. The city lights reflected more clearly across the wet streets. Marcus walked toward the security office. He stopped beside the younger officer who had helped escort Robert earlier. What happens now? The younger man asked. Marcus looked through the lobby toward Robert. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "we rewrite our procedures. No guest removed without identity verification. No exceptions." The younger officer nodded. "And if someone complains?" Marcus looked back at Robert one last time. "Then they complain." Across the room, Melissa carefully placed Robert's union card back into his hands. "I think this belongs with you." Robert smiled. "It belongs with all the other reminders." She looked confused. "What reminders?" He slipped the card into his wallet. "That people show you who they are long before they tell you." Melissa thought about those words. She suspected she would remember them for the rest of her life. Claire stepped beside her father. "Dad," he turned, "I'm coming home with you." Robert studied her for a moment, then smiled gently. "Let's get some pie." She laughed through fresh tears. "Pie? You've made enough difficult decisions for one evening." He glanced toward the rain outside. "The rest can wait until tomorrow." Daniel smiled. "I know a diner that's still open." Robert looked at him. "You still remember?" "I remember everything." Together they turned toward the hotel entrance. Behind them remained the untouched ballroom, the abandoned ceremony, the expensive flowers, the silent witnesses. Ahead waited nothing more glamorous than warm coffee, pie, and 3 people beginning to rebuild something far more valuable than a wedding: trust. And although none of them realized it yet, the story waiting outside the hotel would soon travel far beyond Seattle. By sunrise, the rain had stopped. Seattle woke beneath clear gray skies washed clean by the storm, while commuters carried coffee onto buses and trains without realizing that a single wedding had quietly become the city's most talked-about story. It began with one photograph. Someone had captured Robert Hayes standing in his faded brown coat beside Daniel Mason outside the Meridian Crown Hotel. No dramatic caption, no explanation. Just a simple image of a billionaire embracing an older black man beneath the rain. Within hours, another video appeared. It showed Robert kneeling alone on the marble floor, calmly gathering his scattered wallet, faded photographs, and bus transfers while nearly 200 well-dressed guests stood motionless around him. The contrast spoke louder than any headline. Television stations requested interviews. Newspapers called the hotel. Radio hosts debated what responsibility bystanders carry when they witness quiet injustice. Most of them focused on Daniel Mason. Daniel refused. During his first public statement 3 days later, reporters crowded outside Mason Global headquarters, expecting another story about billion-dollar contracts. Instead, Daniel placed the scratched blue lunchbox on the podium. Every camera turned toward it. A reporter asked, "Mr. Mason, is that yours?" Daniel smiled softly. "No." He rested one hand on the worn metal lid. "It belongs to the man who taught me that the strongest foundations are built long before anyone notices them." Another reporter asked whether Robert Hayes had been an early investor. Daniel shook his head. He invested something much harder to repay. What was that? Trust. He explained how Robert and Linda Hayes had opened their small apartment to a frightened 20-year-old who owned little more than a backpack and determination. He described long evenings learning mechanical design after exhausting work shifts. He told the story of the brass key that opened the first workshop where Mason Global had begun. When someone asked how much money Robert had contributed to the business, Daniel answered with a quiet smile. "Less than people imagine." He paused. "And infinitely more." The room fell silent. He gave me a standard for how power should be used. The next question came quickly. "Will Robert Hayes be joining Mason Global?" Daniel looked toward the lunchbox. "I've asked him many times over the years." "And?" "He always says the same thing." Daniel laughed gently. "There are enough people chasing boardrooms. Someone still needs to fix broken freezers. The room laughed with him, but many reporters also wiped away tears. Across town, Harbor Light Community Kitchen opened its doors as it always had. No banners, no television crews inside. Only the familiar smell of coffee, fresh bread, and vegetable soup. Robert stood beside an aging refrigerator with a toolbox open at his feet. The compressor had begun making a strange rattling noise before breakfast. He tightened two loose fittings and listened. The sound disappeared. Satisfied, he closed the panel. "You could hire someone for that now," Evelyn Carter said with a smile as she arranged coffee cups nearby. Robert chuckled. "I already know someone." "You." "Exactly." Marcus Hill, the warehouse worker Robert had driven to medical appointments weeks earlier, entered carrying 2 heavy boxes of canned goods. "You've got visitors." Robert looked toward the entrance. Claire stepped through the doorway. She wasn't wearing designer clothing, just jeans, work boots, and a navy jacket. Her hair was tied back simply. She carried no flowers, no expensive gifts, only 2 paper grocery bags. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire lifted one bag. "I brought fresh vegetables." Robert smiled. "We can always use those." She lifted the second. "And pie." Now he laughed. "I was wondering when we'd get to the important part." The volunteers laughed with him. The tension eased. Claire began unpacking groceries beside Evelyn without being asked. No announcements, no speeches. She simply joined the work. An hour later, she found herself washing dishes beside Robert. The warm water filled the quiet between them. Finally, she spoke. "I kept thinking about something." Robert rinsed another plate. "What?" "The day Mom died." He slowed. "You remember telling me that grief isn't something you finish." Robert nodded. "You said you learned to carry it differently." "I remember." Claire looked down at the soap bubbles. "I think shame works the same way." Robert dried his hands carefully before answering. "It can." "I don't expect you to forget." "I won't," she nodded. "I don't expect forgiveness because I'm your daughter." Robert looked at her. "Good." She met his eyes. "I want to earn back trust." A slow smile crossed his face. "Then keep showing up." She smiled through tears. "I can do that." "I know." Daniel arrived just before lunch, carrying nothing more than 3 paper cups of coffee from a neighborhood diner. He looked strangely comfortable among folding tables and chipped ceramic mugs. Several volunteers greeted him by first name. He greeted every one of them back. Robert noticed. "You still remember everybody?" Daniel shrugged. "You taught me names matter." They carried their coffee outside. A city bus pulled away from the stop across the street. The familiar rumble echoed through the neighborhood. Daniel looked toward the route map. "The transit project is changing." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "The board approved a new oversight council." Robert listened quietly. "Neighborhood representatives." "Good." "Independent engineers." Robert nodded. "Better." "And Harbor Light has been asked to nominate one member." Robert looked surprised. "They asked us?" Daniel smiled. "They asked the people who actually understand the communities the buses serve." Robert looked across the street where elderly neighbors waited patiently beneath the shelter. Workers finished night shifts. Adults carrying grocery bags climbed aboard. The same people Ethan had never truly seen. "I won't chair anything," Robert said. "I know. But you'll help choose someone." Robert thought for the moment. "That seems fair." Daniel leaned back against the bench. "I've also established a fund." Robert sighed dramatically. "I was afraid you were going to say that." Daniel laughed. "Hear me out. It's never just hearing you out." "No names." Robert looked suspicious. "No statues." "Good. No buildings." "Excellent. No portraits. Daniel grinned. You really don't make this easy. What does the fund do? It pays for apprenticeships in mechanical trades for adults rebuilding their lives. Robert became quiet. No publicity? Only if they ask. No interviews with me? Daniel smiled. None. Robert extended his hand. Then you finally learned. Daniel shook it. I'm still trying. Late that afternoon, Claire walked with her father to the small diner beside the bus line. The same place where he had eaten breakfast for years. The waitress waved as soon as they entered. You're late today, Robert smiled. Long week. I heard. She set 3 slices of pie on the table before anyone ordered. First one's on the house. Robert laughed. You'll never make money running a place like this. She winked. I've got enough. Daniel arrived moments later and slid into the booth across from them. Between the coffee cups and pie plates, Robert placed the scratched blue lunchbox. It no longer looked out of place. Claire rested her hand gently on the lid. So many memories fit inside something so small. Robert smiled. The important things usually do. She opened it carefully. The photograph remained inside. The brass key, the handwritten note, the sealed letter he had intended to give her on her wedding day. She looked at him. May I? Robert nodded. You don't need to wait for another ceremony. Claire opened the envelope. His handwriting was steady. She read silently for several moments before tears filled her eyes again. Daniel looked away to give her privacy. Finally, she folded the letter closed. What did it say? Robert asked gently. Claire smiled through tears. It says, she paused to steady herself, that love should never require me to become smaller. Robert reached across the table and squeezed her hand. No, it shouldn't. Outside, another city bus stopped beside the diner. Passengers stepped off carrying backpacks, grocery bags, uniforms, and lunch pails. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. Robert watched them through the window. Then he looked at the lunchbox resting between himself, Claire, and Daniel. A person's worth, he said quietly, was never hidden. He smiled toward the busy sidewalk, only ignored. The 3 of them sat together while evening sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting warm gold across the diner windows and the old lunchbox that had carried far more than anyone had imagined. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all was this. Nothing inside that lunchbox had ever made Robert valuable. It had only reminded everyone else to look where they should have looked from the very beginning. Would you have spoken up when Robert was forced to gather his belongings alone? Or would you have remained silent with the crowd? When Robert quietly placed that scratched blue lunchbox on the diner table, it wasn't the brass key or the old photograph that carried the greatest value. It was the life he had lived with dignity long before anyone finally chose to see it. This story reminds us that some of the greatest people we will ever meet may never introduce themselves with titles or wealth. The real cost of prejudice isn't only the pain it causes the person being judged, it's the humanity we lose when we decide someone's worth before learning their story. Today, take a moment to notice someone you might normally walk past without a second thought. The next time you see someone standing alone like Robert did, offer a greeting, a kind word, or simply the respect of looking them in the eye. You may never know how much that small moment matters. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had been standing in that hotel lobby, would you have stepped forward to help Robert? Or do you think you might have stayed silent with everyone else? Share your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, I hope you'll join me for the next one. Because sometimes the next quiet stranger carries an even more unforgettable story.